They do not like what we have financed and encouraged, permitted and protected that Israel is doing to Muslims and Christians in Palestine. And they don't like us because we are making it feasible and possible. That does not mean they're right. It's not a question of right or wrong, because what you see as wrong, I might see as right, and vice versa. There is such a thing as selective morality, which is an oxymoron. There's no such thing as selective morality, because morality cannot be selective or it isn't moral. Because if he does it, and it's okay, and he does it, and that's a terrible thing, and it's the same thing, you cannot condemn the one and excuse the other and claim you're doing it on the grounds of morality. Politics, religion, finances, whatever you want. But it ain't moral, folks. That's called dynamic hypocrisy. Where you accuse someone of doing something so terrible, and these people are doing the same thing, but that's okay because we like it. The epitome, we were talking at dinner, the epitome, because no one knows how to pronounce English unless they're native speakers. The epitome of dynamic hypocrisy is revealed in the famous phrase, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And it's true. The people on our side are freedom fighters, the people on the other side are terrorists. And the examples through history are numerous. I was talking to a military audience, I'm honored to have that opportunity from time to time, who said, there are terrorists going into Iraq from other countries to fight the coalition forces. I said, that is your definition of terrorism, Colonel? He said, yes. A terrorist is someone who goes to another country to fight in that war. I said, we're going to have to change the name of that park across the street from the White House in Washington. Lafayette Square? That French terrorist who came here to fight against the British? And in that same park is a statue to, if you remember, Baron von Steuben, the German guy, the German terrorist who came here. They're heroes to us. The British, I'm sure, saw them as terrorists, except they didn't use that word in those days. And how about the book For Whom the Bell Tolls? Do they still force you to read that? Okay. Ernest Hemingway wrote the book about the Lincoln Brigade, the Americans who went to Spain to fight the fascists. Heroes? No. Terrorists. Eagle Squadron in World War II, flying those British airplanes against the Germans, the Lafayette Escadrille in World War I. Terrorists or heroes? Well, it depends upon who you ask. Because terrorism is in the eye of the beholder. To prove this to you, Google U.S. Code, that's the compilation of American laws, Google U.S. Code, Title 18, Section 2331, and you will find the U.S. legal definition of international terrorism. It may surprise you. In 1985, your grandparents have spoken to you about this? 1985, terrorism was big. In Europe, you had the Baader-Meinhof gang, you had the Red Army brigades. You don't remember these, but us older folk do. You had the Achille Lauro, TW-847, the Salguero Luminoso gun. Terrorism was everywhere. Assassinations, killings, hijackings. And in the Reagan White House, there was a cabinet task force on terrorism. It was chaired by George Herbert Walker Bush, who was then the vice president, and I was the deputy director of that task force. On detail from the State Department. Interesting experience. We first met with George Herbert Walker Bush in his office. There were 14 of us, and he said, 2 big assignments, I want you to get right on it. First, listen carefully. He said to us, the working group for the Cabinet Task Force on Terrorism, which had the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, they had the National Security Advisor, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Chief, the CIA Director, all kinds of heavy-duty people. He said, do not concern yourself with causes. What we want from you is how to handle the results. Don't worry about causes. We sort of exchanged glances thinking, So we're going to treat the symptoms, but not the disease. He said, secondly, we need a definition of international terrorism to use throughout the government. So we put one of the guys who was a Rhodes Scholar on that job. He sat down, he drafted, we massaged and corrected a definition of terrorism, which we sent forward. Ladies and gentlemen, it was rejected. He came back and said, for God's sakes, it looks like something, you're describing something that we did. So we rewrote it, and again, we sent out 6 efforts, every single one of which was rejected, because it looked like we were describing America's activities. So after we finished our work, Congress got in. You know about Congress. There was an American humorist by the name of Will Rogers. And he said, there's a certain level of cynicism here. He said, Americans are justified in being intensely proud of the certain knowledge that they have the finest Congress money can buy. Unfortunately, that's largely true. Congress drafted this definition that you can find on the web. And it says, and I'll paraphrase for you because it's quite short. It says, international terrorism, acts threatening or harmful to human life, which would be a crime if committed in the United States or in any other state, when these acts appear to be intended to, 1, coerce or intimidate a civilian population. Can you think of anybody involved in that? Gaza fits. 2, affect the policies of a government through coercion or intimidation. You think of anybody engaged in doing that? And 3, involve assassinations or kidnapping. And that is our legal definition of international terrorism. And we are doing all 3. But that's different because we are the good guys. And we're doing it to bad guys. And if you switch 180 degrees, they are the good guys having it done to them by the bad guys. What is more natural or normal than that? People always tend to see things from their own perception. And perception is the only reality. What you see to be attractive or tasty or sanitary is to you attractive or tasty. Somebody else will say, ugh, how could you eat that? So in the United States today, we have an awful lot of people who know, without equivocation, that we are doing only good things. And we are, unless you ask somebody to whom those good things are being done, and they don't think so. And there's a lot of them, and they have ways to make you unhappy. Awful lot of ways, some of which they haven't used yet. I was telling somebody today that I was on an NPR program several years ago when I was trying to talk people out of invading Iraq. I once served in Baghdad as the American ambassador. When I went there, no one knew where it was. Now they do. Some of them. And the man from NPR said, yesterday when we knew you were coming in today, we played the recording of the big interview you gave a couple of years ago. And everything that you said was going to happen in Iraq if we invaded has happened. Doesn't that make you proud? And I said, no, I didn't want to be right. I did not want to be right. But I knew what was going to happen because I lived there and I worked there. And I speak Arabic and I know the people, I know the situation. An awful lot better than the people who have never been there, who nonetheless think that it's important. I was on a television program where the young woman who was trying to make a name for herself got upset with me. She said, well, you hold it right there. She said, I've been to Iraq. I said, oh, I didn't know that. I only lived there for 2.5 years. Why don't you tell me about it? She came right back. She said, I have seen the fear of Saddam Hussein in the people's eyes. I said, well, now that is a skill. or could it have been your dumb questions? How good is your Arabic? Anyway, I never got back on her show. I don't understand why. But Americans have a very difficult time understanding what other cultures are all about. Partly because they don't care, and that's partly because they don't know. And one of the reasons they don't know is because they don't care. We are much more interested in what's happening to Lindsay Lohan. I once on the radio said that the people in the Middle East hate us because Britney Spears has a belly button. If you want to get right down to the basics. They don't like what we're doing. Words are one thing, but actions are another, because people can see the results of that. And it's unfortunate because we are trying to do good things, but let me ask you a question. How likely was it that the invasion of Iraq, in which the Iraqi people, remember, were going to rush out into the streets and throw flowers at the feet of the Americans? When was the last time an invading army had that happen to them? And what was wrong with Iraq? Well, they had weapons of, oh, they didn't. And we knew that. They had the second highest standard of living in the Middle East. One of the highest qualities of life. The country was incredibly wealthy. And the government was secular. A predominantly Muslim country with a secular government. And the Americans going, you get that, okay. Women were liberated. My principal point of contact at the Foreign Ministry had a master's degree from George Washington University, like I do. Women are liberated. Yeah, that's great. Saddam Hussein's government had in it Christians, Kurds, Shia, and Sunni. It was a secular government. It's good. The country was booming economically until they went to war with Iran, with houses, and water purification, and electricity, and schools, and hospitals. And the country able to stand in the path of possible Iranian expansion. Hey, good. What's left now? Able to stand in the path and no, women are going to be liberal. I'm not so sure. The economy is doing secular. We have destroyed that country. Perhaps forever, perhaps not. But anyone in this room who thinks that the Iraqis are better off today than they were under Saddam Hussein has no idea what they're talking about. And why are we there? I'm not really sure. I have some suspicions. We have no business going there. Iraq had never done anything to us. And now we're in Afghanistan, which is a different situation altogether. But let me speak briefly about Iraq to leave you some things to think about. Ladies, gentlemen, there was a headline in the Washington Post, the paper that I read regularly, several years ago that said, and I quote, Republicans tell Bush that the war in Iraq is harming the party. Good Lord, what could be worse than that? But for the people in the party, that is critical because it may affect their opportunities to get reelected. And what are they interested in? Getting reelected. Shortly after that, there was a better one that came out. My former colleague, Ryan Crocker, who was the ambassador to Iraq until recently, was allowed to meet with the Iranian ambassador in Baghdad. And the next day, Washington Post carried this headline. U.S. accuses Iran of meddling in Iraq. Now, so if Iran is meddling, what word do you use to describe what we're doing? After all, it's right next door. It has an interest there. Are we meddling in Iran? Yeah. And everywhere else. But we see things through a different prism. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is that we're kind of isolated here. We have 4 time zones. If you have 4 time zones, you're out the other end of Europe. It's thousands of miles to the next country, east or west. And if you put a pin in the middle of the United States, it's in Kansas, of course, and you draw a circle with a 1,000-mile radius, diameter, that one country in it. 2,000 miles, you've got one country and little pieces of 2 other countries with which we have borders. Brazil has a border with every country in South America except 2. Russia has 14. We're isolated, geographically and intellectually, I fear. Try the intellectual part. Please, do not ever use a phrase that we've been taught to use and speak about ending the conflict. Ladies, gentlemen, talking about Israel-Palestine, there's no conflict there. The conflict is between two nation states that have borders and armies to defend them. Palestinians have neither. It's an occupation. You want to talk about ending the occupation, not the conflict. That's misleading to Americans who are not terribly well informed and not terribly interested. We also talk about the peace process, but there's no war going on there. It's an occupation. But above all, think you cannot ever speak meaningfully of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. Armed guards do not negotiate with the prisoners. A negotiation is where I can give this and you can give that, but the Palestinians can only beg because they have nothing they can give. It's not a negotiation. It's this. And the boss may not have to crawl in on his hands and knees, but he can do nothing except what the Israelis are willing to give him. And this, of course, is part of the problem because most of the giving has to come from the Israeli side. They are the only ones in a position to give anything of meaning, of substance, of value. Palestinians could do nothing. I once got into trouble with the State Department when I wrote a fictitious letter from Yasser Arafat to Menachem Begin. And it said, Dear Menachem, with this letter which I have today made public, I commit myself without equivocation to stopping every crime committed by a Palestinian against an Israeli within 72 hours of you stopping every crime committed by an Israeli against another Israeli. Call me. How the hell are you going to do that? How are you going to stop every crime? Unless the people tell you beforehand what they're going to do. You can't stop crimes. That's why they're called crimes, I guess, because they violate all the rules of normal behavior and legality. But nonetheless, the Palestinians had to stop all these attacks. You may remember, no you don't, that while the Israelis still occupied Gaza, rockets were fired from time to time because it doesn't take much to launch a rocket, especially the kind that the Palestinians had. You rush out of the house and it's gone. So when they removed themselves from Gaza, and I like that, we withdrew from Gaza totally, maintaining control of the water, the airspace, and the land borders, and the right to return anytime we wanted to kill more Palestinians. Now that's the kind of withdrawal that Mother used to make. It's a serious misnomer. The words that are used are misleading, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not so. But peace process, ending the conflict, negotiations, that is shatteringly misleading to all those Americans who do not really understand what it's all about. I'm going to stop in a moment and take questions, but let me leave you with some other thoughts. On one of the trips that I made, oh, by the way, I am barred from re-entering Israel for 10 years, which I think is unfortunate because I've gone there many times with groups of people trying to explain and to talk and to bring together and moderate and mediate and all kinds of things. I can't do it anymore. On one of the trips, we met with a man named Bashar al-Assad, president of Syria, who, as you may know, is a British-trained ophthalmologist. He wasn't expecting to take over the family business, but his older brother died in an automobile accident. And President Assad said to our little group, every time an American comes in here, they metaphorically pound on my desk and they demand, they insist that right now, this minute, to seal the border between Syria and Iraq to prevent those people from going in to fight the coalition forces. He said, what I have learned to do is to frown thoughtfully for a moment and say, you know, you're right. Could you have the U.S. Border Patrol to come over and show me how they did it with Mexico so I could copy theirs? This is a case of don't do as I do, damn it, do as I say. Because it's awful hard to do that If we can't, then we expect him to. I have also met with a man named Gemayel, who is the hereditary head of the Lebanese Druze. The Druze are a sect in Islam, very secretive, special. It's a different group. He lives in a castle, come fortress, come museum, top of the hill overlooking Beirut. And we had at that time in the Bush administration the man who was the Middle East director for the National Security Council, a man named Elliot Abrams, whom some people in this room are old enough to remember. He's a convicted felon who lied to Congress, who was pardoned by the president. He is an ardent Zionist, and he was in charge of the Middle East. Jumblat is his name, not Gemayel. Walid Jumblat. Very French, very theatrical. He said, Abrams stood right there, and I said to him, Mr. Abrams, you must be bursting with pride. You must be filled with achievement that you, almost single-handed, have overcome the obstacle of centuries and given Iran a solid foothold in the Eastern Mediterranean. Congratulations. I have met with a man named, it'll come to me in a moment, the head of Hezbollah. Can't think of his name right now. And he said, look, understand something, you Americans. We are happy to accept help and assistance and money from Iran. But Iran does not tell us what to do. We are our own group. We're happy to accept their help. They don't tell us what to do anymore, he said, than the Israelis do what you tell them to do, although they're getting all of these things from you all these years. He said something else that was interesting. He and a man named Khalid Mashal, who is the spokesman for Hamas, with whom he met, both of these gentlemen said the same thing, which I think is interesting to consider as a diplomat at least, perhaps as a student, as a teacher, as an activist. You guys keep insisting that we should recognize Israel. That's right, by golly we do. You should recognize Israel. Well, you're diplomats. Recognition is reciprocal. I recognize her, she recognizes me. That's what recognition is. But no one has ever suggested that Israel should recognize Palestine. But it's always reciprocal, and only reciprocal. Secondly, what are we recognizing? Where are the borders? All of the West Bank, some of the West Bank? We're recognizing a state, but we don't know where it is. And part of it, they think, is where we think we are. And thirdly, groups of people, Hamas, Hezbollah, do not recognize states. States recognize states. That's the way it's always been. But in my country, people don't deal with these kinds of issues because it is very difficult to speak out on them, as I have had good reason to learn, because Americans are either uninformed or reasonably informed, and an awful lot of them are very strongly opposed to me saying the kinds of things that I'm saying, even though I consider myself to be immoderate, which, as Martin Luther King said, is not necessarily a good thing, because, you know, moderation in the face of injustice is not a wonderful thing. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going on this next Gaza trip. I'm getting a little old for this kind of thing. And I don't particularly relish thinking about what it is that the Israelis may do next time in an effort to stop any more flotillas from showing up on the horizon. Because they do tend to become very stressed when somebody, in their eyes, threatens them. Gaza is a mess. How many of you have ever been there? Doing what, sir, can I ask? What were you doing? It's an interesting place to see. I went once with a small group to the place where Rachel Corrie was killed. If you remember who Rachel Corrie was, the international solidarity movement, the young blonde American girl in Gaza who was standing in front of a Palestinian home with white walls, with a bullhorn, a bright orange visibility vest, trying to keep a bulldozer from knocking down the walls. The driver never saw her. They drove over her, backed up over her, and she died. It's interesting because the last pictures taken, if you've seen them, were taken over her shoulder. There she is with her bullhorn. And there's the bulldozer from Caterpillar. And there's the driver, and he's even got his lights on, although it's full daylight, and he never saw her. Well, I'm kind of suspicious about that because he wasn't coming at 80 miles an hour around the curve. He was in a bulldozer. And I've been taken to the place where she was killed, where the Palestinians built a small monument which the settlers who still lived there came out and tore down. So they rebuilt it, and it was torn down again. Now the settlers are gone, having destroyed the houses they were living in. And they're going to build a more permanent monument to Rachel Corrie. If you read any of her writings, she's a very interesting young woman. Of the kind that I would like my kids to have as a friend, as a leader, as a teacher. It's too late now. So, who moderates the questions? Me? Okay. I'm ready. Oh, gotta get the microphone.